Hi. Here's something not a lot of people can say. I met my wife outside of a hospice while people were debating, actually the nation was debating whether or not it was humane to pull the feeding tube from her. Not everyone's idea of romance, I admit, but it is a little bit of a window into my life, the life of a journalist. My wife is also a journalist. She's a reporter for the New York Times, and I'm for the Boston Globe. And a lot of journalists end up finding meaning in some of these kind of horrible, difficult circumstances, and we're no different than that. And it's also meant a lot of interesting experiences. As John was pointing out, I've been to the prison at Guantanamo Bay. I've been to a university where you can major in theme park management. I've covered a trial of a 12-year-old who received a life sentence for murder. On the other side of that, I've covered discipline for police officers who spent too much time in the overnight shift at Dunkin' Donuts. And as John alluded to, I hand counted after the election some of the dimpled ballots of Palm Beach County, Florida. We are under attack now, what I do, I feel, by ideologues on both sides who are angry at us for various reasons, but more importantly by an economy that at times, some of the work that I do has a difficult time integrating. And I have a little bit of an excuse for being maybe a little less prepared than some of the speakers here tonight, because I just finished a week ago covering this Senate race between Scott Brown and Elizabeth Warren, one of the biggest Senate races in the country, and for my money, probably the most interesting. And what I want to talk about is a little bit about the Senate race and a little bit about, again, as John alluded to, how we, in an era of digital journalism and Twitter and a lot of free journalism, how we, the kind of journalism that's old and dinosaurish and costs a lot of money to make, is still relevant. It still matters. And I also, to do that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a window into this, how we covered this Senate race that just ended, give you a few examples of a few kinds of stories. It was a very exciting Senate race because you had two very compelling candidates. You had Scott Brown, who was a come-from-nowhere guy who became a star of the Republican Party for taking Ted Kennedy's seat. And you had Elizabeth Warren, who was a real celebrity of the left for the work that she had done. And so there was lots of interest in this, and it ended up being more money spent than any campaign in the country on ads, because they were both able to raise ridiculous amounts of money. And there was a lot of pressure on us, a lot of opinions of people who said we were doing things completely wrong all the time. The campaigns were calling, the partisans, and that's typical for reporters. That's what you're dealing with, and we have to take that very seriously because we want to get it right, and we do need to listen to everybody and think about it. I mean, ultimately, we have to make independent judgments, but they can't be in a vacuum. We can't just be listening to ourselves. So the first kind of story I wanted to talk about is a fairly straightforward kind of story, a very routine story in an election like this, and that was Scott Brown got an endorsement from Mayor Michael Bloomberg of New York. The first thing we would do is we would put it on Twitter, because in the political world, like in a lot of worlds, that's the quickest way for people to get news. The next thing we would do is we would blog it, and then we would be able to provide a little bit more context, sort of what this means to the campaign, a story like this. In the case of Scott Brown, he was really trying to emphasize that he was an independent, and Michael Bloomberg is also trying to emphasize that he's an independent, so it fit with that message. On the other side, it fit with a message that Elizabeth Warren had, that Scott Brown was the Wall Street candidate, and she was somebody who was fighting Wall Street and standing up to Wall Street. And Michael Bloomberg, of course, being the mayor of New York and a man who made a lot of money on Wall Street, is very symbolic of that as well. And then the next step in a story like that is we work on the next day's story simultaneously. And in this case, it was another reporter on the campaign team who was working on it, and I was assisting him. So my role would be to go out to the candidates, get some direct responses from them, and then his role was to make a more contextual story for the next day that dug a little deeper. Bloomberg said he was endorsing Scott Brown because of the issue of gun control. Great. So let's look up Scott Brown's record on gun control. So of course there's a whole slew of things to analyze from his state Senate career and his career in the US Senate. So the next day we hope we provide something that's more than just a tweet more than just a blog post, but giving you, what may be a fairly simple story here. One man endorses another. They're not even always covered in the newspaper, but give it some real complexity and depth and a window into a real issue. The next, but again, that's a fairly straightforward kind of routine story, and I brought it up almost out of a hat just to show you that. But the next kind of story, I would argue, is more complex, one that took me a couple of weeks, and that was a story on the deficit, a very sexy issue that I know everybody gets very excited about. But it's a very important issue right now in politics, and something that candidates love to talk about all the time, but they tend to do so in vague terms. So we, in this sort of old school journalism, we do something very complex and hard to figure out. We ask them questions. And so what I decided to do was, let's give them a list of very detailed questions. Okay, what entitlements are you willing to cut? What taxes are you willing to raise? And what are some specific things that you'll cut? And I asked them to give me answers from the campaign and give them time to do so. This wasn't a pop quiz where we were trying to play gotcha. And then we took it to independent budget analysts, and we said, help us score this. Help us figure out what the impact would be on the budget and the deficit. And so we did that, and we went to each campaign, and we said, this is your score. We're not going to show you the other person's score, but we'll show you yours, and you can argue with us, you can debate us, you can tell us we're fools and idiots. But that way we'll make, again, we want to make sure we get this right. It's the take-home exam. It's not something meant to trick people and catch them off guard. But then we used that scoring, and we were able to tell people, okay, here's side by side where the candidates stand. Here's how much this one would cut from the deficit. Here's how much this one would raise taxes. Here's what they would do to entitlements. Here's what they weren't. And we published all of that, and we published their direct responses. And to me, that's serving the reader in a very important way. You're giving them both analysis and direct information, and allowing them to choose whatever rubric they want to make their decision on a particular issue. And we did a number of issue stories that followed this model. And again, I think this is an important kind of thing we do. And the last example I'm going to give is the fact check model. And I think that this election was pretty well known in political journalism as the fact check election. It was also, I think, the Twitter election. And those two things at times can be complementary, because Twitter is an instant corrector, but at times I think they're also in opposition, because on Twitter you're emphasizing brevity and speed. On a fact check, you can't always go that fast. You really have to be diligent and look through things. The other aspect of Twitter, I think, is that you self-select yourself to get you decide what's feeding into you. So a lot of times it could be the people who exactly agree with you, and the facts that they believe may be the same set of facts that you believe. And as has been talked about quite a bit, we're in an era where people are picking and choosing their own sets of facts. So the story that I wanted to talk about a little is a very complicated story that took me several weeks to figure out. It was based on an attack that Scott Brown made against Elizabeth Warren to undermine her credentials as a consumer advocate, to say that no, she was really somebody in her legal career who defended big business and did things that hurt the little guy. And in this case, it was an asbestos case where she was representing the Travelers Insurance Company, a giant mega company, and getting a couple $100,000. And the narrative from the Brown campaign was she was taking this money, and at the end of the day, asbestos victims, who she was on the side of Travelers, and the asbestos victims were not going to get any money. And that was all true at one level. But this was a case that was 2 decades long. Enough legal files, I would suspect, to fill this entire room. Enough lawyers to fill maybe 2 more of these rooms. Several legal cases. And, try tweeting that sort of information. It's going to be difficult. And it was not a simple story at all. It turned out that when she was working on the case at the Supreme Court level on some fairly esoteric issues, she was on the side of most of the victims. Now, you could argue that she should have foreseen that Travelers would try to get out of making the payoff, which was about $500 million at the end. Or you could argue that she couldn't have foreseen that. But again, I would argue that you could not have made either of those arguments intelligently if you weren't reading the Globe. A lot of blogs were writing about this, and they had very strong opinions, and I don't think that they had the same commitment to the depth on a story like this or the objectivity on a story like this to really give people a sense. And the Globe throughout the campaign wound up being the fact check. During debates, you know, the commercials would often cite the Globe, even occasionally accurately. And you know, we found ourselves constantly like playing whack-a-mole on all the things that were coming up. And it wasn't just me. We had a lot of other reporters working on this. And this isn't even to bash other news outlets. There was a lot of great work done on this story. A lot of national media came in and covered this story because it was so compelling. But what I do want to use these examples for is to tell you that there really is a place for this sort of old-fashioned, you know, however you want to characterize it, dinosaur legacy journalism that we do. And there is a possibility that some of the newer media, and we consider ourselves newer media as well, by the way, you know, we're doing all the same things, but some of the non-legacy media will do the same things, and some of them are, but some may not. And I just want to finish by telling you about the first paper I worked with in Duluth, Minnesota in the mid-90s. And the internet was a lot different then. It was, you know, we were still sort of describing what the internet was whenever we wrote about it in a story. But Duluth is like a lot of cities in America, you know, a fairly substantial city, but not a big city, and not a big media city. You know, we were basically it. There were 3 TV stations. They didn't have a Fox station because they weren't quite big enough. And the local stations didn't have very big news budgets. And so this was the job that we were doing. The same thing that I just discussed with the Brown-Warren race. This is what the Duluth News-Tribune does, and this is what tons of papers like this do every day at every level, you know, at the city council, at, you know, mayor's elections, all these things. I've done them at every election I've covered, some variation of these kinds of stories. And I think this is so essential. And you know, one of the reasons why I'm glad to be talking to you is because I've seen the emails, how you all have these amazing talents and abilities, and I'm hoping that just by hearing me, somebody here, even somebody who thinks that information is yearning to be free, will find some economic model, some genius thing that will make what we do economically viable. I'm not asking for a ton of money. I don't mind. I'm not saying, I don't really care if my company makes a ton of money. That, you know, that's fine with me too. I just want to make sure that we can keep doing what we're doing, and that we can keep doing what I think is vital to democracy. And I appreciate you all listening to me today.